You're right, guys. Shay here. Uneven bounce. Hope you guys are well. So they say sport and politics don't mix, but I'm not sure that's the case when it comes to cricket South Africa. I'm here today, delighted to be joined by Lawson Naidoo to discuss at the moment, aborted plans for the more aggressive transformational targets to be adhered to going into the next couple of seasons for cricket South Africa. Here today to discuss the all things transformational, regarding transformation, should I say, with Lawson. How you doing?
All good, thanks. All good. But disappointed that the England tour has been called off early, but at least we've got a couple of games of cricket in.
I think if we were discussing CASA as a whole and how far Scott's been over the last few months, we could be here till tomorrow. So we're just kind of, I think, yeah, I mean, it's very disappointing, I have to say, from a point of view as well. I wanted to kind of get the whitewash kind of complete as of Thursday, but yeah, not to be anyway. So yeah, I just wanted to read a couple of paragraphs out of the recent articles come on Cricinfo from Fidos Munda, the South African correspondent. So just to give a bit of background to obviously what's happening now regarding transformation in cricket South Africa. So if we read here, since targets were reintroduced after the 2015 World Cup, the national men's team have been required to include 6 players of colour, of which at least 2 must be Black African. But they do not need to have that combination every game. Instead, the target is calculated on average over the course of the season, which allows some flexibility in selection. While that accommodation will remain, in a presentation made to the country's sports minister, Nathi Mthethwa, the percentage of Black African players required in the team is now 25%, up from 18% until the end of last season. Next season, 2021-2022, the percentage increases 27%, and in 2022-23 season, it sits at 33%. The number of players of colour required overall sits at 58% now, and will increase to 63% by 2022-2023. And that actually, I spoke just briefly off camera, Lawson, it kind of, the fact that there's only a 5% increase overall from now to next, in essence, two and a half years. But there's obviously much more of a push on Black African players to be more heavily included in the starting lineups, is where I want to kind of focus on a little bit today. What was your initial thoughts, Lawson, when you obviously read this news?
Well, one of surprise, to be honest, Shay, because it came out of nowhere, really. I mean, given the context of where cricket South Africa has been over the last few months, the levels of disruption there, the fact that we now have an interim board in place with the previous board having been removed. So this really came as a shock, and my immediate response was, well, where does this come from? How has it been discussed and agreed upon by Cricket South Africa? And it's been presented, allegedly by Cricket South Africa to the Minister of Sport. And yet, a couple of days after that announcement came around, the interim board indicated that they had not been consulted on this. And what's now happened is that that proposal has actually been withdrawn because it hadn't been discussed with the interim board, and they've obviously got more pressing governance issues to deal with. But this is obviously a critical issue that has certainly arisen in South African cricket much more starkly in the last few months in the wake of the whole Black Lives Matter movement and the speaking out by players of color in South Africa about racism in sport and the lack of transformation. And I think one of the major complaints or issues that has arisen in this discussion has been the fact that there's been this, single-minded focus on targets or quotas without understanding the broader context of transformation and what that means. It's about creating an environment where more Black players are coming through the system from school and grassroots level, and creating an environment where players feel comfortable in that environment. And I think the words of Makhaya Ntini when he spoke out about the way he felt when he was in the dressing room, very much a loner, and that culture, that's the culture that needs to change. And we can, impose targets and quotas as much as we like, but it's not going to, really transform the way cricket is played and seen in South Africa until we transform the culture that is associated with the sport. And I think that's, again, speaks to the issue, highly controversial in South Africa in the last couple of weeks, of Cricket South Africa taking a decision not to take the knee in the white ball series against England. That has had huge ramifications here, and it's really it's Cricket South Africa saying we don't take transformation seriously. But here are some numbers that will placate the protagonists of transformation. That to me is not about transformation. That's really window dressing. It's not dealing with the core issue. So you want to impose targets and quotas, but you don't have the system in place to produce the players that come through that are able to fill those targets.
Just touch upon that. Obviously, Lawson, I'm based in the UK. Obviously, you're there in Cape Town. So, obviously, the reaction to not taking a knee during initially the T20 series against England, was that met with a huge backlash there publicly, or was it?
No, I think it's been a significant backlash. I mean, I think it took a lot of people by surprise. Given the debates that have been taking place in South Africa as well as globally, obviously a lot of it started with, Michael Holding's comments during the series in England in your summer, which resonated around the world. On the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, and it landed. It was a message that landed in South Africa and gave, I think, Black South African cricketers and cricket people the opportunity to speak about issues that hadn't really been spoken about openly for far too long. And this was an opportunity for Cricket South Africa to really say, this is where we stand on this issue, and we're unequivocal about it. But they equivocated on the issue, and it calls into question the commitment of Cricket South Africa, whoever Cricket South Africa might be at this point in time. But it calls into question that commitment by cricket to a real transformation and to address the very painful legacies that apartheid and racism have inflicted on sports people in South Africa. Cricket just being one of the codes in that regard, but it goes across the board. So I think, yes, the backlash has been huge. There's people who are really saying, well, there's been all this change, but nothing much has actually happened because, we have Cricket South Africa really, sticking the finger up to Black South African cricketers and cricket fans.
So you felt that obviously, as you mentioned now, there's been a severe backlash to the fact they're not taking a knee. You felt this was simply a reaction to this. Well, okay, to keep the people happy. Well, because the timings, obviously, as you mentioned before at the beginning of this interview, was very odd. It came out of the blue, but obviously there was the fact the issue a statement saying they're not going to take the knee. Obviously met with backlash, as you mentioned, and then all of a sudden, a week later, it's okay, guys, we're going to increase our transformational targets over the next 3 seasons. But as you mentioned, it's more of a top-down reaction as opposed to a bottom-up, which is maybe where it should be. Because just what I would say about in terms of the culture, which is very interesting, and you cited McKinney-Teeney's comments a few months ago. The fact is cricket there, you still feel generally considered a white sport, quote unquote, throughout the country, or?
Very much so, yeah. I mean, it is changing. There are a number of coaches at franchise level now who are Black coaches, but that's going to take some time to permeate through the system and for that culture to be instilled in cricket at a franchise level. So a start is there, but what support is there for that? How are we ensuring that at the grassroots level there's a better allocation of resources to underprivileged areas, previously disadvantaged areas? Where is school sport taking this issue? What are the facilities like in poor neighborhoods to create an environment for kids to begin to start playing cricket? Those are the fundamental issues that are not being addressed. So, we have a pool of Black players, many of whom, who are very, very good. And as we've shown over the last few years with the coming into the team of the likes of Rabah, Lungi Ngidi, and others, that the talent is clearly there. But how do we effectively identify and ensure that that talent comes through the system? And in my view, not sufficient attention is being paid to that. And it's really about it's really saying, well, we're going to have these targets just to placate the noises out there, but without really fundamentally transforming the way cricket is structured and played.
like you mentioned before, I think in the more rural areas in the country, it's obviously a mass part of the country. You're not seeing enough cricketers come through, Black African cricketers come through. It seems to be people like Andile Bebekwayo, Temba Bavuma, Rabada, and Ngidi all came from wealthy backgrounds. I think especially in Ngidi and Kakisa Rabada's case, we're not seeing people from the townships breaking through. And that's, I think that's kind of indicative, as well.
Well, that's been the experience in South Africa. That will be, pretty much all of the Black African cricketers have come through by going through to what we would call in South Africa Model C, or former white schools, where the facilities and the infrastructure and the coaching exists to be able to nurture that talent. But we need to broaden that base. We need to have cricket being played in more schools, better facilities at those schools, to allow us to really tap into the talent that is undoubtedly there, but it's not being mined adequately. And that's where Cricket South Africa, together with government, this is not not something that Cricket South Africa can do on their own, but they need to forge a working partnership with government to say that together, how are we going to do this, and together with other sports codes as well, because you can't just create a cricket field. You've got to look at being much more creative given our lack of resources. How do we create multi-purpose sports facilities where a number of sports can be played in the same space at different times? So there needs to be some creative thinking going into that in terms of how we broaden the base of access to sport at a very basic level.
It feels it's a sense of irony to the whole thing that Makai Natini obviously came from a township, and in Port Elizabeth, I think 22 years ago, ironically, he was one of the first Black cricketers to play for South Africa, and he came from a township. But 20 odd years on, they're still coming from a wealthy background. You should be all the way around. You would have thought, if anything. I sometimes think the Makai Natini is just the right place at the right time for him. When he got picked up.
It was it was right place at the right time. He had the right coaching at the right time. And I think through sheer will, grit, and determination, he came through and was a superstar for South Africa. But he's in some respects he's quite an exceptional individual, because he's got such a level of determination to succeed. And he proved that. But we need to find a way of getting more players from those backgrounds coming through. And as I say, not enough is being done for that. So it comes back to the earlier point about, so where do these figures come from? So obviously there's a transformation office within the administrative structure of Cricket South Africa that has obviously crunched some numbers and come up with these so-called solutions to the transformation issue. But as I say, it clearly hadn't been discussed with the interim board. When they became aware of it, the chair of that interim board, Justice Sak Yaqub, last week said he had no idea where it had come from, and the decision was then taken to put those targets on hold until there's been a proper discussion of that. And as I say, with the old board having been removed, discussions around transformation, discussions around how we deal with the deep-seated racism that still exists in South African cricket, which are all unresolved. So it would appear that this issue around the announcing of these targets was intended to deflect from that more fundamental discussion.
I mean, I obviously, with the interim board being in charge, as pointed by the sports minister, how did a decision like that come to light and be executed as official before being withdrawn? How would it have to go through the interim board whilst they're in charge?
Well, exactly. One would have thought that is what would have happened. What should have happened? It clearly didn't. It was an announcement that came out of the administrative structure of Cricket South Africa, which is in a state of disarray at the moment. The company secretary of Cricket South Africa, Welsh Gwaza, has been suspended last week. There's suggestions that other senior members of the administrative staff may also be suspended in time to come, as a result of the forensic report that the interim board is dealing with, the report that has now finally been made public a couple of weeks ago. and implicates a number of senior officials within Cricket South Africa in all of the wrongdoing that had taken place. So there's a real crisis there, and that's, it could affect really the top echelon of the administration of Cricket South Africa. Motives behind the timing of this announcement, whether it was really intended, to catch the interim board off guard and to show them in a bad light.
Okay. So for just are you frozen there, Lawson? Oh, Lawson, can you hear me? Oh. Let's give it a second. Oh, seems to have lost Lawson at the moment.
I can hear you now.
Oh, there you go. Perfect. It's just froze on my screen here.
Yeah.
Lawson, but hopefully you've pitched to come back. Okay, so you feel like it's obviously. I know obviously it's very the kind of the transition and for the interim board to come into power, if you will, was very acrimonious to say the least. So there's a lot of resistance there. So, I mean, my understanding is that the interim board is only in place there till January next 6 weeks time, pretty much. I think it's end of January. Is maybe this decision to increase transformational targets something that will be revisited in February next year, once the interim board have departed, if they do depart time?
Well, I hope that it's going to be a discussion, a broader discussion around what transformation means in the context of South African cricket. And clearly, targets are one component of that, but it can't be the only component. And I think that's been one of the failings of Cricket South Africa's strategy over a number of years. And hopefully this board will put in place a process to deal with that. The board has got a very specific mandate, which is to steer the ship for a 3-month period to lead Cricket South Africa to an AGM where a new board can be elected to take forward cricket and to deal with all of these long-standing issues. So I don't think this is a core focus area for the interim board. This is obviously a long-term issue, but they obviously need to be kept abreast of what is happening, and they clearly weren't. And I think the decision that's now been taken to place this thing on ice for the moment is the correct thing to do. We need to deal with the governance issues in Cricket South Africa, have a new board in place, have a new administrative structure in place, and enhanced levels of clean governance in cricket. And then we can begin on the basis of those new structures to really tackle the deep-seated problems that face South African cricket. So I don't think there are any easy or quick answers to this. And it's not about tweaking the numbers as to whether it should be 63 or 68% of players of color in the team. That's not the issue. The issue is the foundations, is the philosophy of transformation the correct one? Because if we get the philosophy right, the numbers will take care of themselves in due course. But at the moment, we don't have the basics in place, and we haven't addressed them properly.
I think that kind of leaves the certain people in certain sectors in the South African society. You see on public forums, social media, unfortunately, it can be a cesspit for some certain times. But you'll see a lot of comments obviously being thrown regarding certain players being picked. I won't name any names, but I feel like not their own merit. And I feel like because obviously it's these kind of band-aids that have been thrown at the situation as a quick fix measure, as opposed to, like you're saying, changing the mentality and the approach transformation and truly understanding at its core what the policy means. I think, like you said now, Lawson, until that's actually implemented, there'll always be whipping boys there. Unfortunately, there'll always be people there who are there to be taken to task because they're just there on what's perceived as the color of their skin, and that's the unfortunate part of this. And I did actually want to kind of delve a little bit more into numbers, Lawson, if that was okay, because obviously I mentioned before off camera the fact that if you look at the percentages, you said here now, so if you look at the end of last season, it was 80% of Black African players that need to be in the 11 across the course of the season. And by the end of the 2022-2023 season, it's due to be 33%. It's almost double. It's almost double. But overall, the colour representation in each South African 11 is only up 5%, from 58% to 63%. And for me, it's what, obviously as an outsider, it seems to be much more of an emphasis on Black African players being pushed to the fore. I mean, given high representation, understandably so, with a contract 76% Black African. The second, obviously, large demographic behind Black African people is white South African people, just over 9%. And then South African coloured people with 8.9, I believe it is. And then you've got the Asian South Africans, 2.5. So, which is also in below. But it seems to be, I said, more of an emphasis on Black African players. Now, is there an argument here, you could say, that you could have changed the numbers, but by maybe not increasing the overall total players per side, but increasing the number of Black African players per 11 across the course of the season? For example, keep it at 6 players for now, 6 players of colour, but say maybe 3 Black African must be in each 11 as opposed to 2, which is what it is now, or even 4 Black African, but keep it at 6, and not to maybe do too much too soon in terms of the white South African players who do make up a large portion of the talent there within the current available players that are at About's disposal. If you automatically reduce the numbers, like you're doing from this 2 years, it'll be 4 players only. Obviously, another player drops off. It's from 6 to 5 now. It's going to be 4. Because it seems to be more emphasis on Black African players, was it simply a case of let's keep it at 6 players of colour and maybe push the Black African contingent to a higher number? Is that something you feel like is plausible, or it had to be an overall number of colour players or players of colour?
These are internal debates and discussions that happen in the context of South Africa. Is how do we, what does representativity mean in the context of South Africa, given our history, the ethnic composition of the country, and so on. And I think cricket can really take a leaf out of the book of rugby in South Africa. And I think in many respects, rugby went through the same sort of process that cricket is still grappling with, in terms of players being undermined when they're selected, being labelled as quota players. Sia Khaleesi was labelled a quota player when he first came into the Springbok reckoning, and there he was lifting the World Cup last year. So it's that kind of mentality that cricket has to address and be able to deal with, which is, I think it's proven itself that it's a fairly long way away from that. But so these are South African discussions that happen as to how what does representativity mean? How do we achieve that in the context of a particular sport? So in rugby, your players of color are either Black African or so-called colored players that play the sport of rugby, and whereas in cricket you've got a broader pool of players. You've got Black African, you've got so-called colored players, and you've got players of Indian origin who all play the game and have come through and performed at a high level for provincial sides as well as for the national side. So how you slice that cake at the end of the day, is not really the issue. The issue is, are you creating sufficient opportunities for players from all of those previously disadvantaged backgrounds? So we would call players of color in South Africa players that have come from previously disadvantaged backgrounds, where access to facilities, resources has not been the same as it has been within the white community. Have we begun to address that adequately in those communities? And the short answer is no, because most of those players, not just the Black African players, but so-called colored and Indian players that have come through because they've gone to very good schools that have had the infrastructure and the facilities to enable them to succeed at the highest levels. And so the broader issue is about how do you widen that level of opportunity and increase the pool of players that you can ultimately draw from. And I think once we begin to address those issues, then we can have a discussion about the numbers. But to start with having a discussion about the numbers is the wrong way of approaching the issue.
But obviously, these things have been imposed on the Proteas, aren't they? These numbers, unfortunately, they are. I mean, what is your feeling towards? Let's say here we look at the other side of the coin here, and white South African players that coming through the system. So, for example, a Calvin Rayner, he was 23 years old. He's players trained in the franchise system. He's obviously doing very well for the Cobras. He's had obviously his one-day call-up at the start of the year against Australia. Did very well. Just call up the England series as well. They would have played him, sure. It looks like him. Yerman Milan, 24 years old. Marcus Ackerman. These people are on the peripheral of a call-up at 24 years old. What you're feeling about players like that who obviously they want to play for their country, but ultimately one spot has been taken away because there's no there's a max amount of white players. There's no max amount of any other race. There's a minimum amount. There's a minimum amount of Black Africans and players of colour, but the reality is you can field 11 players from Indian origin, Black African origin, coloured origin, but you cannot field 11 players of white origin. You see, and that's where I do have to feel a little bit for the players of a white South African background because they look at that and say, well, I really want to play for my country. I'm born and bred here. I'm passionate about the country. There is no Colpat exit anymore. That obviously that loophole's gone. So where do they turn to? Because what you're seeing is a lot of franchise players on the peripheral of their franchises. I know Dolphins in particular, who I follow. There's certain players there who are just taking up all the jobs, it seems like, set up academies, getting into conservation, because they've already realised that there's not really any major opportunities for them going forward, even if they're good enough to represent their country, because the pool is so small now for them. They're only one of four. You're not getting into a team of 11. You're ultimately aiming for one of four spots. I mean, what is that a fair comment, Lawson, or is that kind of a
well? Again, it's yeah. I think it's got to be seen in the context of South Africa, of South African history, and the imperative in South Africa across all sectors of our society, not just cricket and not just sport, but in professions, in business, and elsewhere, of what is referred to in South Africa as redressing the injustices of the past, where you had a quota system under apartheid, where every member of the South African national cricket team had to be white. So you had a quota system with 11 white players, and we've clearly got to move away from that. And part of the process of moving away is about putting in place targets and quotas, because had we not had these targets and quotas up to now, we would not have seen, very clearly, we would not have seen the number of black players that have represented South Africa doing so.
Do you fully believe people like Ngidi Rabada, we would not have seen them if there was no quotas in place? We would not have seen them given an opportunity.
I think it would have been much tougher for them to get the opportunities. We've seen again in the former players speaking out in the last few months in the wake of the Black Lives Matter issue that I referred to earlier. A number of players speaking out about how difficult it was for them to get the opportunity to play as good as they were as black cricketers. So that hasn't changed sufficiently. So I think we're going to look at quotas in the context of this is a part of a transition to move towards a more united cricketing fraternity in South Africa. And I think the ultimate goal has got to be that we no longer have quotas within representative playing teams in the country. That the playing fields have been leveled to an extent that we, that's no longer necessary. But for the moment, it's clearly necessary because the institutional culture of South African cricket still discriminates against black cricketers. So, to answer your question head on, I think if there are white cricketers in South Africa, of which there are many, many, who are exceptionally talented and will be able to represent their country because they're good enough. And, like every cricketer and every professional sports person, you've got to fight for your place. And if you're fighting for 5 places, well, then you've got to fight for one of those 5 places. But the competition in professional sport is what it's actually about. So oftentimes I think that's a very weak, lame excuse to say, well, we must, continue with the status quo where white cricketers are still privileged within the system, and that cannot be correct.
No, fair enough. I see what you're saying. I mean, it's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, though. It's ultimately said professional sport. I mean, I think this is where obviously the understanding of the history of South Africa comes into it. I think from an outside perspective, like myself, I understand it more than other outsiders, obviously, for obvious reasons. But it's still, I think that's you see why you get people are a bit confused and don't really understand the strategy so much when they see these things come out in the media about these more and more.
I mean, I saw a ridiculous comment on social media today or yesterday about David Milan, for example.
He would have played for South Africa or something.
Yeah, somebody who knows very little about cricketing but knows even less about David Milan says that he left South Africa because he wouldn't get a chance to play for us. And it's that kind of sentiment that is still so pervasive here. Any white cricketer, if they want to succeed, must leave. Well, we've had more than enough white cricketers who have and will continue to succeed. The likes of Quinton de Kock, Markram, and others will still come through the system and rise to the top because they're good enough and they want to play for South Africa. And those are the cricketers I think we want to encourage to be part of the system here that recognize and have grown up in what we call the new South Africa, democratic South Africa, and accept the realities that this country faces and the changes that still have to be made in cricket to make it a truly national sport. And I think some of the decisions that have taken recently, particularly the decision around not taking the knee, have set South African cricket back a long, long way. And you cannot talk about transformation without putting that into the conversation, because that's about the broader picture of how South African cricket is seen by spectators and fans and sponsors, no less importantly.
Indeed, I mean, I made a video about that. The fact that I was pretty disgusted, to be honest, that there was not a knee wasn't taken prior to the England series starting, because I feel like we saw South Africa in particular, because of its history, it should be one of the leading nations, to take the knee. I mean, as I mentioned in this video that I shot a couple of weeks ago now, like no one really cared about the 3TC tournaments, as we know what the origins behind it anyway, and then also no one really watched it. No one really cared. This is a high-profile series against the world champions. Everyone's watching.
I mean, to all intents and purposes, despite its very laudable charitable aims of raising money and so on, it was a private initiative. It was not Cricket South Africa. It was not the Proteas. This was the first time the national team had taken the field since March. In fact, since England were last year.
Australia were there.
Sorry, Australia were just after England.
Yeah.
So, the first time the Proteas had taken the field in 8 months, and this was an opportunity to really make a significant statement about where South African cricket stands in relation to racism in sport, racism across the globe, and standing in solidarity with the global Black Lives Matter movement. Something that South African cricketers themselves have been talking about. And yet, a decision is taken. It's not really adequately explained as to why the decision was taken, how it was taken, and so on. So, there's a real level of questioning of the motives behind the decision.
And even when they issued the joint statement, it was diluted by mentioning, I'm not obviously trivializing these issues, they're huge issues, but gender-based violence and COVID deaths, that was like wrapped up in the same statement, along with the BLM movements, which, as you said before, it just clearly shows through their actions, they're still not taken seriously enough, this transformation policy.
No, and that's certainly the message that has been conveyed, the perception amongst many Black cricket fans in South Africa, certainly. And I think probably most cricket fans of all races, is that this was an opportunity lost by Cricket South Africa to say to cricketers in South Africa and to the world, this is this is our struggle. This is what we need to still deal with as much as the rest of the world has to deal with it. But we have our own peculiar circumstances and history that we've got to overcome in South Africa.
Absolutely. I think it's a great place to end the conversation there, Lawson. Thank you so much for coming on again. I've really enjoyed it. And yeah, guys, if you enjoyed the content, please do like, comment, subscribe, as I always say. I'll be pushing this out, this video. So yeah, you'll catch little snippets on Instagram tomorrow. And yeah, so if you want to see more of Lawson Naidoo, please subscribe, and you will see, I'm sure, much more from the future. Hopefully not as frozen as he was in this interview. We're going to see him moving
it's rather warm here, so
I can see, yeah, you can see the little, little spot. Yeah, enjoy. Cheers. Anyway, guys, yeah, hope to see you again. Thanks again, Lawson. Appreciate it.
Cheers.